What do Candy Corn, American Psycho, Racehorses, John Edwards, and Bright Lights Big City all have in common? I would just like to start this video by saying my interest in this topic first began with my uncles. My father's family was born and raised in Chicago and would mention from time to time the disappearance of old Mrs. Brock, of the Brock's candy fortune. It's like an old Chicago mystery that was never solved. I dove down a rabbit hole of a pretty remarkable story that I think deserves telling. First, let's start with old Miss Brock. Originally Helen Voorhees, she married Frank Brock, the son of the founder of Brock's Candy, the makers of the indomitable candy corn. Mrs. Brock was involved in racehorses and had continued the hobby after the death of her husband, Frank. In 1977, Helen Brock flew to Minnesota to get a checkup at the Mayo Clinic and was never seen or heard from again. Supposedly, she was to fly back to Chicago and then on to Florida. She said that her houseman was waiting for her at the airport after her visit to Minnesota. Of course, the houseman or driver was investigated but denied everything. He was never imprisoned and the case went from murder inquiry to disappearance. Only in 1984 was she declared dead. One theory into her disappearance was her involvement in horse racing and breeding. Recently, she had purchased some horses for $150,000, a lot of money at that time. She hired a separate appraiser who told her the horses were worthless, or worth significantly less. She had purchased them from a Chicago stable owner named Richard Bailey. Bailey was later implicated in a scheme in which he tricked gullible or trusting older women with lots of money to buy worthless horses at top dollar prices. Now, it doesn't take a detective here to see what might have happened. Mrs. Brock was going to blow the whistle, and she got whacked for her troubles. This lay dormant until 1989 when the case was reopened. Although Bailey was not convicted of murder, he was convicted of defrauding her in the horse scam. During the investigation, it was brought to light that Bailey was an associate of one Silas Jane. Silas Jane is a shadowy figure in the horse world as well as the underworld of Chicago. He was deeply enmeshed in the world of both horse training and caring for them. He worked together with his brother and had become a successful stable owner in the Chicago area. It is said he had a predilection for young girls and would often take advantage of the young women who came to his stable. When their fathers complained, he intimidated them by saying he would spread the word of their dishonorable acts. He was also known for his violent temper and a general sketchy reputation for deals, schemes, and violence. Silas Jane had been implicated in a horrific murder nearly 20 years before in the 1950s. A group of teen boys had been murdered at one of his stables. The rumor being that Silas Jane caught one of his employees taking advantage of the boys on his property. He freaked out and killed them. This murder to this day remains unsolved. Additionally, Jane was close to many members of the Outfit, Chicago's murderous mob. Supposedly, Mad Sam DeStefano would keep a horse at Jane's stable. Occasionally, DeStefano would play cowboy dressing up and shooting his guns in the air while riding a horse. Jane was also linked with several more murders, as well as a long-standing feud and the eventual murder of his own half-brother and fellow stable owner. He was additionally suspected in the murder of a detective in the 1960s who might have been onto another large-scale horse-related scam. Jane and others would purchase horses and then kill them, collecting the insurance policy. Jane engaged in this, as well as the wealthy men who were the owners of the horses themselves. In the 1980s, Jay McElhenney moved to New York City and wrote the famous book Bright Lights, Big City, about the disaffected lives of yuppie transplants to New York City. He went on to write several more books, one called Story of My Life, featuring the main character, Allison Poole. Later, Bret Easton Ellis would borrow this character and put her into two of his books, one being American Psycho. In the film version, her name is still mentioned by screenwriter Guinevere Turner.
Where did you two meet?
Oh, God. We met at, at the Kentucky Derby in 85. Or 86. You were hanging out with that bimbo Allison Poole. Hot number.
What do you mean? She was a hot number.
If you had a platinum card, she'd give you a blowjob. Listen, this girl worked at a tanning salon. Need I say more?
Poole was based on a woman named Lisa Druck, who Jay, while living in New York City, had dated. Druck was the daughter of a wealthy lawyer from Ocala, Florida. In the book, and obviously based on a real story, Poole tells her friend that her father came into her room drunk and tearfully admitted to murdering her show horse, Dangerous Dan, for insurance money. This was, of course, the character's one true passion: horseback riding. This was based on Druck's real father, who represented insurance companies and knew intimately how the deaths of horses were investigated. He came up with an idea that if you electrocuted them in a certain way, the investigators were unable to figure it out. He then killed Druck's famed show horse, Henry the Hawk, a trauma from which she would never recover. The whole horse-killing scandal was revealed in a 1992 Sports Illustrated article. Druck's father was mentioned along with several other conspirators, and the case of Helen Brock was also included in the article. Although not mentioned, the shadow of Silas Jane hung over the article. Okay, are you still following me here? Time for one last thing. A young and idealistic politician and lawyer was looking to run for president. People liked him, said he could win. He was a lawyer and politician from North Carolina. He hired a woman named Rielle Hunter to make behind-the-scenes campaign videos for him. She made tight, well-shot, and edited moments, which she uploaded on YouTube. They were a success, and she was considered one of the first to realize the viral marketing potential of YouTube. That man was, of course, John Edwards, and Rielle Hunter's real name was Lisa Druck. As we all know, they had an affair complete with a destroyed sex tape and a love child. John Edwards' career was ruined, and Lisa Druck was a new mother. Rielle Hunter is still around to this day and lives in California with her daughter, and I'm sure some child support from John Edwards himself. I'm not sure really what became of John Edwards. Jay McElhenney is still around and married to a Vanderbilt. Silas Jane died in the 1980s, and technically the case of Mrs. Brock is still open. My point being, all this came from the casual mention of a spooky story coming from my dad and uncle's childhood. It's amazing what can happen when you start pulling a thread. You never know where it might end up.